All right, thanks for having me, and thanks for that introduction. It's been a while since I saw the movie trailer. So today I thought I'd talk about some of the keys to creating a unicorn. Does everyone here kind of know what a unicorn is now? Sort of this, yeah. So basically, there's a good article in TechCrunch recently talking about the probabilities of creating, startups creating $1 billion company, and they were rare enough that the author sort of labeled them unicorns. Probably the most frequently asked question I get asked by entrepreneurs is, what it takes to create a successful startup, what would be considered a good startup idea, or they ask me to evaluate their specific idea, and this is the mental model that I use. It's what I'm going to talk about today. So what does it take for startups to succeed? And as part of that, I want to talk about the problem of distribution, which is how people find out about your product. And then I'm going to sort of tie things together by answering the question, what was in the water at PayPal? Why did PayPal spawn so many successful companies? There are 7 unicorns have been founded by PayPal, sort of the PayPal Mafia group, which is the group of people who were part of PayPal before it was acquired by eBay. And there were only about 220 people in that group. So statistically, it's been this really unusual thing that a relatively few number of people in Silicon Valley have created so many valuable companies. I want to talk about why that might be the case. So to my mental model, this is sort of what I run through when somebody presents me with an idea. So start at the top of this funnel, and you've got a founder who has an idea, but it's still sort of in the realm of fantasy. They're hoping it can be a $1 billion idea. And I kind of run it through these filters. So the first thing I kind of ask is there a market need? The raison d'etre of every entrepreneur is to figure out some need that isn't being addressed by the current market. And this isn't exactly easy because markets aren't totally inefficient. So there's a lot of existing companies addressing needs. And so to figure out something that isn't properly being addressed is non-trivial. I think one of the tricky things about discovering markets is that it can neither be too small nor too big. And let me kind of explain what I mean. On the too small side, I once had an entrepreneur pitch me this idea for a new auction site that would use videos of the product. And I said, well, wait, that's basically eBay, but instead of photos, you're using videos. And they're like, well, yeah, but videos are a lot better than photos. And I said, well, that might be the case, but you haven't really discovered a market need. That amount of differentiation is not sufficient to really create a new site and disrupt eBay. That would be an example of something being too small. I think you see this sort of problem quite a bit where the innovation is just too incremental to really truly be addressing a sort of a market need, that the market for that is going to be too small. On the other side of it, a market can be too big. So I think one of the problems that happened with the whole kind of clean tech boom is that they were trying to disrupt the energy space, which was just so big that fracking came out of nowhere and basically almost like stole that opportunity. And so most of the clean tech companies have not worked. And so there's this problem that if your market is too vast, or if you've defined it to be too vast, there's going to be too much competition and too many unforeseen things can happen. And so you almost want the market to be discrete, something that you can get a foothold very quickly, but then you can expand it over time. And so the classic example would be something like Facebook, where its initial market was Harvard. Within 2 weeks, it had completely taken over Harvard. Then it expanded to the Ivy League. Then it expanded to all colleges and universities, and then it took over the whole world. And so ideally, what you want is for your initial market to be something you can win. It's small enough that you can win it, and yet it's still a meaningful market that you can kind of expand what you're doing to do something bigger and bigger. And so those types of combinations are sort of difficult to find. Once you sort of have an idea of what your market need is, you develop the product. And the thing I look for a product is what I call the hook, which is a simple interaction that users will believably engage in. So sometimes I see entrepreneurs who've got this great idea for a market. They have pointed out some market that's inefficient, but they haven't been able to productize that insight into something that I believe people will actually use. The product is too complicated. It doesn't immediately engage people. And really what you're looking for here is a simple behavior that users will repeatedly engage in. So it could be the tweet, right? It's a simple status update, or it's, you know, you push a button and a town car shows up. And that's sort of Uberification now, which is the sort of creating push button interfaces that do one thing. I think it's even more sort of important design principle now in the age of mobile. You know, the problem with designing a site that doesn't have a hook is that it's very hard to get users to engage in more complicated behaviors if you can't get them to engage in a simple behavior. And so complexifying your product and adding a whole lot of bells and whistles won't necessarily improve it if there's not like a core behavior that users are willing to engage in. Now, sometimes you'll get products that the hook is just explosive. And even to the point where the entrepreneurs didn't even know what their market need was. They just built this product. I mean, Twitter was kind of like that, where it just took off. I'm not sure that the creators knew exactly they'd be disrupting the news industry or sort of taking that over. But they felt like people would use the product. And I think that's also a very sound way to go, that you can sort of, you know, given a choice between a founder who's discovered a market need versus one that has a great product hook, I would rather take the product hook, even if it means that they still have to figure out what market they're actually disrupting. And this is why, you know, entrepreneurial types tend not to be the super analytical sort of, it's not like it's not necessarily the McKinsey consultants or the Harvard MBAs who figure out these new markets. It's the more, you know, eclectic, idiosyncratic entrepreneurs who figure this stuff out, because they're able to actually build a product that has a hook and gets traction, which I think is very frustrating to kind of the people who would like this process to be more tracked and sort of analytical. But I think it's worth keeping that in mind. So once you have sort of a product hook and a market need, you've got product market fit, you know, which is sort of that all important concept. But I don't think that product market fit is sort of the entirety of what you need to build a billion-dollar company. I think there's two other things that you really need. So the third one is a scalable distribution model. Again, distribution is the question of how do people find, discover, use your product. It could be sales, it could be SEO, it could be using friend virality, using Facebook's platform to go viral in the feed. It could be what I would call real-world virality, where you share an Uber with somebody, and now that person has discovered Uber, and they will use it. So this idea of how do you quickly scale, how do you have a technique that gets you to scale is very important. And what's, I think, tricky about this is what I would call the law of distribution arbitrage, which is that successful distribution techniques are copied until they are no longer unusually effective. Okay, so if you think about SEO, the first people to use that technique got a lot of traffic from Google. Then a whole bunch of people started doing it, and they started gaming the system. And then eventually Google did their notorious Panda release, and everyone who was using SEO basically lost most of that traffic, and the rug was pulled out from under them. If you look at like Facebook platform, the friend virality was very, very powerful in the early days, and then eventually people got sick of the spam, and they stopped paying attention to it. If you look at kind of the early days of social networks, all of them used an address book importer and would blast your whole, you know, email address book, and that worked until people stopped clicking on the invites. And so the techniques that work initially to get distribution they don't stay working, I guess. And the reason is because everyone copies them until the channels are just spammed to death. And so what this means is that typically if you're going to have a breakout startup, you've really got to think about how you're going to innovate on distribution, not just product, right? And the biggest mistake I see these days that I see brilliant startup founders who are brilliant product people, and they've really thought about their product, but they haven't really thought about how they're going to make it grow. And then they launch their product, and it's like crickets chirping. No one's using it, and they're kind of flummoxed as to what to do because they've never really spent time thinking about it. And they just kind of assume that, hey, if you build a good product, everyone's going to find it. And the reality is it's a big web out there, and that's not necessarily true. You really have to think about how people are going to get to it. And one of the issues here is that I'm pretty impatient. I think people who invest, VCs are pretty impatient. I mean, you kind of have about 5-6 years or so to build a $1 billion company, or people will kind of assume that it's not going to happen. It'll be hard for you to raise money. It'll be hard for you to recruit talent and so on down the line. And so, if you're going to build that much value in such a short amount of time, you've got to have some really unusually effective way of getting lots of users really fast. And when you just think about the fact that that users resist being, new ways of acquiring them, they sort of get inured to all the ways that you try to get their attention. This really raises, I think, the difficulty. The technique that I like the best is virality. So all the products that I've been part of creating, whether it's PayPal Genie or Yammer, all had a viral dimension to them. But virality, in terms of just doing this whole sort of invite your friend, address book importer virality, doesn't work anymore. I mean, people are sick of filling out invite forms. There has to be something in it for the inviter or the recommender. So thinking about their motivation and why they would do this, why they would invite a friend or business colleague or something like that is critical. At Yammer, we were one of the first companies to make enterprise software viral. And because that had never really been done before, we were able to get tremendous traction in the enterprise. I'm not sure those same techniques would work today because enough people have now copied Yammer's distribution technique that it might not be as effective 5 years later. So something to really keep in mind. Then there's one more thing. So if this wasn't challenging enough, you've got a product that's got product market fit. You've also figured out a scalable distribution technique, so it's growing really fast. There's just really one more thing you have to figure out, which is how do you create a moat around your business? One of the problems with creating software, is that it's very easy to copy. And I don't mean pirate. I'm not saying anyone steals your code. I'm just saying anybody can look at your UI and basically reverse engineer their own version of your product. And believe me, if you get any measure of success, if you create a product that gets any kind of product market fit or distribution, within months you will have people copying you, whether it's sort of the European version of your product launched by the Samwer brothers, or some big company takes notice and puts what you're doing on their roadmap. Somebody's going to notice and start copying what you're doing. Within months of launching PayPal Genie and Yammer, we had sort of copycats, including really big companies. In the case of Yammer with Salesforce, it took them about 18 months to launch their product, which sounds like a long time, but they also have a lot more sales and marketing muscle behind their product than we did. And so even though it was 18 months delayed behind us and the product wasn't as good, they already had an existing customer base and a huge army of salespeople and a huge marketing budget, and we didn't have any of those things. And so the question is, how are you going to compete against the inevitable copycats, clones, competitors, and big companies who wake up to the idea once you've taught the market that it was lacking? And so I think the key here is there's a number of different techniques. I mean, obviously, probably the best one is network effects of some kind. You've got like a 2 or 3-sided marketplace here, and so it's very, very hard. You can copy the product, but you can't copy the network of people who started using it. You can't copy the community. Maybe there's some, I like this less, but there could be some technical barrier that's just extremely difficult to copy. So if you take a look at like Dropbox, you would think that desktop sync would have been copied a long time ago, but it was actually such a technically difficult problem to get that to get the usability of it so perfect the way that Dropbox did, that barrier has proven to be pretty enduring. And then there's sort of this network effect that comes about through sharing. So again, I think that's sort of the fourth thing to think about, is just how do you make your product non-copyable? How do you make it defensible? And I don't want to make this too depressing, because I think it's like almost impossible to figure out these four things ex ante before you launch your product. If you can just think about the first three, I think you're in pretty good shape. And quite frankly, if you can figure out your product hook and a scalable distribution model, you can figure out everything else later. You can figure out, actually, you may not even have total clarity about the market you're disrupting, but you'll learn that over time. And you may not have figured out how to build your moat, but you'll figure that out. But you do need, I think, a pretty clear idea of what your product hook is going to be and how to scale distribution. Once you do those four things, you will have a billion-dollar company. No fast-growing product that has a real market behind it and can't easily be copied in Silicon Valley doesn't achieve a billion-dollar valuation. So that gets me to bonus points, what I would call bonus billions, which is if you can create a product with adjacencies, then you will not just have a billion-dollar company, you could have a $10 billion or $100 billion plus company. And an adjacency are markets that are very closely adjacent to yours. And your product gives you tremendous leverage into moving into those markets. So it's very hard for even an existing company that's successful to move into doing new things. But sometimes your existing product gives you the capability and the leverage, the assets to do that. And so if you think about, like, the classic example would be with Microsoft, when you think about the synergy that, that Windows gave them into winning sort of the office productivity space. Classic adjacency, probably double the value of the company. If you think about companies like Facebook, when you think about the power of the social graph, the leverage, the opportunities, the option value that gives them to move into closely related spaces, it's very powerful. That's what makes, I think, a company go from $1 billion to 10 billion or 100 billion, is that there's a lot of sort of options for the company to move into to adjacent markets and expand what they're doing. So that's my framework. That's kind of what I run through when an entrepreneur shows me their product or pitches me their idea, and I think it drives. Other investors may not have this framework quite this formalized, but I think a lot of these are factors in their thinking as well. So I'm gonna end with sort of this question, and I'm gonna open it up to you guys to ask questions. What was in the water at PayPal? And I think one of the really key things was that PayPal innovated not just on product, but on distribution as well. And so this goes to my point earlier. PayPal was one of the first products to use a viral strategy. So you could email money to somebody even if they didn't have a PayPal account. And then they would get an email saying, click here to get your money. And then when they clicked, they would sign up. And so the product was sort of viral from day one. We were one of the first products to use a platform strategy. So this is really before the days before web platforms existed. We kind of turned eBay into an involuntary platform for our applications. So we did all these things to kind of bootstrap ourselves off of an existing platform, which is a great tactic for getting distribution. You go somewhere where the users already are, and in this case, PayPal was able to get this kind of explosive growth by bootstrapping off of eBay. At the time, eBay called us a parasite. They didn't like the fact that we were this application on their platform. I think, but remember, this was in like the early 2000s. I think circa 2006, Facebook changed everything by launching a platform for web apps. And I think that changed the psychology of the whole industry, and big web companies started thinking of themselves as platforms or potential platforms, and that therefore kind of derivative activity or applications was actually something to be encouraged, not suppressed. And so today, there's a whole host of platforms for you to choose from in terms of getting bootstrapped that are going to be much more sort of friendly to your application than sort of eBay was to PayPal before we ultimately sold the company to them. And then I think the third sort of tactic that we used, and this sort of goes along with the second one, is we were one of the first companies to use embed. So you could actually embed a PayPal payment logo or a payment form on your website or auction, and that would drive users back to PayPal. And again, this is very commonplace today, but back in the early 2000s, this was like a really new technique. And it was one that I think some other PayPal Mafia companies were able to use very effectively, so most notably YouTube. So if you think about the way that YouTube embedded videos on MySpace and other sites in the early days, and that's what really rocketed it, that was a technique that was sort of pioneered at PayPal. And so, again, all of these techniques today are commonplace, but in the early 2000s, we were one of the first companies to do them. And I think, again, that innovativeness, that we were innovating not just on product but on distribution as well, is something that all the PayPal Mafia companies have done. It's interesting to compare. I mentioned that there were about 220 sort of pre-IPO PayPal people here in management, and they produced 7 sort of post-PayPal unicorns. If you look at a company like Google, which has something like 20,000 employees, literally 100 times more employees, there aren't 7 sort of unicorns created by ex-Googlers. And it's a really interesting question why. I mean, it's basically, I think there's maybe 1 or 2 sort of ex-Google unicorn type companies, and even though they had 100 times more employees. And I think I think this sort of scrappiness around distribution is a big part of the explanation. When you work at a big company, distribution is guaranteed, right? I mean, Google already has hundreds of millions of users. And so when you think about creating a product at Google, I mean, Google understands hits and misses. I mean, they understand good products versus bad products. But the one thing they really don't have to pay tremendous attention to is this problem of you're an entrepreneur working in a small team with very few resources, right? I mean, the one thing they have are tons of resources, tons of users. And you've got to figure out from 0, how do I get my first user? How do I get the second user? How does that grow to 10 users? How does that go to 100, then 1,000, then 1,000,000? They never have to think about that. They've got guaranteed distribution of 500 million users. And so I think that scrappiness about distribution is one of the key reasons that there's been sort of so many kind of PayPal Mafia companies. I think it's an interesting thing to think about as you guys create your own startups. So with that, I will open up to questions. Sure. So the question was about embed strategy. So an embed is it's just a simple little line of JavaScript that some third party can embed in their site or their blog or their eBay auction. And what PayPal did is we gave people that little snippet of code, and so they could just append it to their eBay auctions, and that would create a PayPal logo and drive traffic back to our site so people could complete the payment. There's quite a bit you can do with this stuff. It doesn't just have to be like a logo. It can be a form of some kind. So I think when we got more elaborate with it, we actually let you enter the dollar amount of the transaction in the form, and then you click submit, and it would kick you over to a PayPal payment form where you could complete the transaction. So if you think about like the YouTube example, YouTube gives you this snippet of code. If you put that on your blog, it'll just play the auction inline. So it's a way to essentially create inline distribution for your product. The value of it is that if you can get third parties to copy and paste that snippet into their sites, you drive awareness of your distribution throughout the web. Now, I guess I should say that this is a tactic that works best on the web. I mean, it's really a browser-based tactic. I don't think this works in the new world of applications. And this is what I mean by saying that a lot of the techniques that worked 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, or maybe even 1 or 2 years ago, won't work today. You have to constantly innovate new stuff. So for instance, SEO. SEO was something that worked for many years, but today, because of the shift to mobile, people don't really search the same way. So you're very unlikely to get meaningful SEO traffic I mean, it's something that's nice, but I don't think by itself. If someone came to me today and their distribution strategy was SEO, I would say that's not going to cut it. There was a time when it would cut it, right? So Yelp got tremendous distribution initially off SEO. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for being here. I want to ask about the product hook. Can you elaborate a little bit more on this? What was the hook in Yammer and in PayPal, like the initial one, or did you pivot it and make another hook? How can you figure out what hook to use?
Right. So the question is, what was the hook with PayPal and Yammer, and how do you figure out what hook to use?
Yes.
I think so. Let me talk about PayPal and Yammer first. So with PayPal, it was simply having a payment form where you address a dollar amount to an email address, enter your credit card, and click submit. And I believed that that was an interaction that users would engage with. So to me, it's all about, I mean, again, we're evaluating an idea before it's launched. Once it launches, you can just see whether it gets traction or not. But before it launches, the question I ask myself is this believable? Will users actually engage in this? And frankly, that comes down to a lot of product intuition. Fundamentally, founders need to be good product people, and that just means having intuitions about what users will actually do. And it comes from looking at what people are doing on other sites. So for Yammer, the product hook was simply a little status update form that said, what are you working on? So we had this idea for enterprise social networking. Our fundamental belief was that social networking wouldn't just stay in the consumer space, that employees would want to use this tool at work as well. But we had to figure out what the right incarnation was of that idea, like what was the right product hook. And once Twitter launched in mid-2007, that was a huge lesson for us because it showed how simple social could be. It was really just about posting into a feed. And I didn't think, for instance, that people would be willing to create like the sort of a corporate Facebook in the early days with all the bells and whistles, not as a hook. I thought we could get people over time to build that, which they did, but I thought that it wasn't a hook. And once Twitter launched and they sort of had that status update, I thought just asking the simple question, what are you working on, was enough of a hook. Because enough people would fill that out that all of a sudden your feed is populated with content, and that makes the site interesting enough for everybody else who's coming to the site, and that gets them to contribute content, and then they'll fill out their profiles, and then you've got an enterprise social network. So you start with the simple behavior, and then you can layer stuff on top of that. And again, it kind of comes down to will users realistically want to do this? It's hard to get users to do anything, as you guys know. So keep it simple, and then if there's precedence for users engaging this type of behavior elsewhere on the web, it's very helpful. So that's the point. Yeah. Oh, whoever's got the mic. Okay.
Yeah. Hello. I have a question concerning copying. I'm from Germany, and
Yeah.
like 95%, I think, of the startups that are copied in the US.
Right.
And I wanted to hear what your take on that is. And yeah. Elaborate. A bit
Yeah.
more.
Well, I think it's basically just a fact of life that that sort of imitation is the best form of flattery, that if you do something interesting or successful, there's going to be no shortage of people trying to sort of copy it. And so therefore, it's incumbent upon you as a startup founder to figure out what makes your idea non-copyable. I mean, I just kind of take it as a fact of life. I'm not intending to like criticize anyone who's doing this. I do think that for you guys, it's better to think about original ideas. Now you can be inspired by things other people are doing. So for instance, clearly in creating Yammer, we were influenced by both what Facebook and Twitter had done on the consumer side. But at least that was really, I mean, enterprise and consumer are two different markets, and we really kind of started with learning what they had done and then tried to port it over to the enterprise in a enterprise-friendly way. So I don't think if you want to be successful, you can just be completely derivative. You have to innovate somewhere. But I guess my point here is once you have figured out your innovation, you also have to figure out how to make sure that other people don't copy you to death. And you know, like especially if you're selling your product. So like if you're doing enterprise software, and everyone starts creating a version of your product and giving it away for free, what's going to allow you to maintain your pricing pressure? So it's a particularly acute problem if you plan on charging for your product. Is what's going to allow you, because you know a lot of software wants to be free. A lot of software goes open source. So you've got to really figure out why you'll be able to maintain that pricing power over time. Yeah, whoever's got the mic.
What were your initial strategies on user engagement and customer retention? And mainly for B2C companies.
So with respect to?
As in, like most of the companies into B2C space, the user engagement is like really important. So what were your, it would be great if you can give some suggestions on the user engagement part.
Yeah, so the question's about user engagement. I think you want to make sure that you're measuring the way you define users in terms of some sort of like active or engaged number. You don't want to just be looking at like total signups or total registered users. You want to be looking at the sort of recurrence rate, and so you want to be looking at like monthly active users or DAUs or WAUs, weekly active users or something like that. One of the things I think we did pretty well at Yammer was start to apply all these consumer techniques and metrics to an enterprise product. So we actually did track our DAUs, WAUs, MAUs. We tracked our one-day retention rate, which is something. So we ran a lot of A/B tests, like a consumer internet company would, and these ideas are all pretty commonplace now. But back then, no enterprise company was really using these techniques. So the one-day retention rate is a really important metric. It's basically just tells you what % of yesterday's users came back the next day. And the reason why that's really valuable is because you can also look at what your 1 month retention rate is, meaning how many of last month's users came back this month. But the 1-day retention rate and the 30-day retention rate are extremely correlated. So directionally, you will know whether things are going well if you just look at the 1-day retention rate. And obviously you can get that data within 24 hours of launching a new feature. So you don't have to wait 30 days. So we always looked at the 1-day retention rate of any new feature we did. We were able to sort of, we would sort of run it against a control and see whether it boosted the 1-day retention rate. I think it's like a really useful technique.
So how do you measure the market need if you're having a totally original product in a total like new space?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like I said, I mean, I'm not sure this was top of mind for Mark Zuckerberg when he created Facebook or the Twitter founders when they started Twitter. So you can sort of grope towards this, but nonetheless, I think that, and I think it certainly matters more on the enterprise side than the consumer side. I mean, the consumer internet these days is really about you launch a product and then it gets like, it's like a hit or a miss. And like if it hits, it gets crazy traction. And no one would have thought ex ante that there was a market for it. And then it somehow catches, like sort of Snapchat or something like that, and it catches fire. And the founders have vague intuitions about what the market need is, but it's not completely thought out. On the enterprise side, you really have to think this through. You can't just kind of wing it. You really have to think about like who is going to pay for the software, like whose pain point are we solving to the point where they're willing to open up their wallet. And so, if that's your model, you really have to think through this stuff.
Okay, so you mentioned that Yammer was acquired by Microsoft. I'm sure before that you guys got other offers. What made you say no to those other companies and finally yes to Microsoft? When did you know that it would kind of reach the tipping point?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a bunch of reasons why the Microsoft deal happened. Fundamentally, Yammer is an enterprise social network. Social networks need killer apps, and Microsoft has kind of all the killer apps that we wanted to integrate with in the enterprise. So Office, Skype, Link, and the list kind of goes on and on. So it was a very attractive company for us to be part of in that sense. I also think that culturally, Microsoft is very engineering centric, whereas a lot of the other enterprise companies are very sales centric, and that was appealing to us as well. So, we just thought that the opportunity for us to kind of grow what we were doing as part of an integrated suite with these killer apps was more attractive than what we could do by ourselves. I mean, that was sort of the fundamental thing. In terms of the business terms, I'm not, saying anything that wasn't sort of public at the time, but, we had just raised a funding round less than 3 months before at, less than half the valuation. And so we had a fresh valuation to compare the offer against. And so in terms of getting our investors aligned with wanting to do it, it's sort of the numbers spoke for themselves.
Hi, I'm from China, so this question is about Copycat. We have, I think it's a very successful copycat called Alipay. I'm sure you know that. It is developed by Taobao.com, which is the biggest online shopping site in China. And like many years ago, eBay also has its market in China, and Taobao said, we're going to beat eBay out of China. And at that time, everyone thinks it's a joke, but they did it. Like eBay has no market in China at all, like now. So what do you think of Alipay? Because for me, it has more like features and is more convenient than PayPal, at least for people in China. So what do you think of this Copycat?
Well, honestly, I haven't used Alipay, so I can't really speak to it. But based on what you're saying, it actually sounds like it's not precisely a copycat in the sense that you said it had a lot more features. So, my guess is that they learned a lot from what PayPal was doing, but they also had their own ideas, and that's sort of the combination that you want.
So I'm curious to where you think, you said because everything's going mobile, so where do you see the distribution model kind of going now that things are going mobile? Because everything's changing, so.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I've kind of said is that the web is sort of the long tail of applications you haven't installed yet. I mean, it's really kind of amazing that we're back to the world of the desktop as opposed to kind of, there was this belief, I think, in the 2000s that the desktop was kind of withering away and that everything would move into the browser. And now we've gone 180 degrees away from that, where the browser is withering and everything's moving into applications. The main difference between the desktop of today versus the desktop of the 90s is that there's a cloud back end to it, right? So before, all the assets were on the client. Now it's a shared model where there's some assets that are on the local device, namely the app, sort of the graphics and the framework, but the data resides in the cloud. And that makes it super convenient for you to get your data across multiple devices. And it's obviously perfectly in sync, and there's one copy, and you don't have to email file formats around and all that sort of stuff. So it's really interesting how the model has changed. I think that it's always hard to specify in advance exactly what distribution techniques are necessary for the new medium, precisely because you have to be innovative. So if I figured this all out, then probably it's too, you know what I mean? It's almost like too late. You have to figure that out for yourself. Now, we can look at what other people have done that's successful, and again, that may work for some period of time, but eventually that'll get tapped out too. I think, to me, the trend right now that I see is, again, what I've called Uberification, which is the slimming down of application interfaces into push-button experiences that do one thing. I need to get a ride, I push a button, the car shows up. If you can Uberify your experiences so that they're slimmed down, so that there's a single call to action that users want to engage in repeatedly. I mean, I don't know how extensible this is. I don't know how many things in the world that UI applies to, but that certainly seems to be the zeitgeist right now.
Okay, so yeah, this side. Hello. Yeah. Okay, so as entrepreneurs, we always keep hearing this fact that to gauge market need and to see whether this product market really needs this product or not, go and talk to customers, build a minimum viable product, and see whether people are really willing to and looking forward to using something like this. Do you have a refreshing take on how entrepreneurs can probably gauge a market need for a product, or is it like just the lean startup method, go along, build and change and pivot till the time you get the right fit?
Gee, now I feel like I wasted your time and that you already knew everything that I was talking about. So, um, you know, um, I guess the lean startup methodology makes a lot of sense in that it's very hard to predict ex ante what's going to work. And so I think honestly, you're doing in the early stages is throwing spaghetti against a wall and seeing what sticks. I mean, you'd like to say that it's a completely predictable process, but it's not. I mean, we're all constantly being surprised by what works. How many people would have said that like Snapchat would have broken out or something like that. And so, I would urge you to keep these concepts in mind because I think they're very important. But on the other hand, this is not an analytical top-down process. It's an experimental bottom-up process to figure out what works. Now, I would say that, and this might be a little different than the lean startup model, is once you have a product that starts getting traction, I don't believe in staying lean anymore. I think you should go fat. And what I mean by that is you should rapidly scale up. So, and the reason is because you're going to have all these copycats and they're going to start eroding your market. And so one of the things we did with Yammer that I think was pretty successful is, I'll tell you the history. So when we founded the company, we were in LA. And for about the first year, we were 15 people. And we started getting some traction. We did about $1 million of enterprise sales in our first year. And at the time, I was thinking, gee, this is like really cool. We could be profitable in just a few months. And then we moved the company up to Silicon Valley, and I became much more aware of the competitive landscape. I got the sense that Salesforce was going to launch a competitor, and I started thinking, wait, why do we want to be profitable? We need to grow. We need to win this market. And so we then engaged in a process of raising big financing rounds about once a year for the next 3 years. And in fact, one year we did 2 financing rounds. And we scaled up the company. By the time we sold the company to Microsoft, just 3 years later, we had over 400 employees. And by the time Salesforce launched its product, we were at 200 employees. So if we had remained that lean 15-person team, I think a big company like Salesforce would have stomped us. But because we were able to go fat, once we saw that we had traction, we built up some muscle. We had 200 people. Half of those people were doing sales, half were doing development. We were able to withstand the assault. So I think the lean startup methodology is good, but sort of in that experimental stage. But once you have something that works, you can't be afraid to pour gasoline on the fire. Because I think the risk is not typically that you're going to like somehow spin out of control, that you're somehow going to grow too fast or like raise too much money, but that rather that you're not going to grow fast enough to seize the opportunity you've created, and that somehow everyone else in the market will figure out that you figured something out and they will rush to copy that.
First of all, thank you. That's very helpful. I'm curious, you talked about the secret sauce of PayPal and your ability to innovate on product and distribution. Can you talk a little bit more about what that meant in terms of your talent, your resources, whatever tools you use? Like what was it actually about your team mix and the skills that people brought to the table, in particular when it came to ability to innovate on distribution?
I think it really came down to the fact that we devoted the same sort of time and thoughtfulness to distribution as we did to product. And that I think sometimes founders they just assume that if they build a good product, the world will come knocking at their door. I mean, the old line that if you build a better mousetrap, the world will, come knocking or whatever. I actually don't think it's true. Like, I don't think people can find the better mousetrap. It's not sufficient just to create one. You've got to figure out how to bring it to market in a scalable way. So, I think clearly there was something special about the PayPal team. I think one of the reasons for that is we never used recruiters or headhunters in the early days. The whole team was really recruited through friendship networks. So, Peter Thiel, who was the CEO, I'd gone to college with him. He recruited me. I recruited my friends, and so on down the line. Max Levchin, who was the CTO, he'd gone to U of I. He recruited his friends from U of I. So because the whole company was born out of these friend networks, the people tended to be cut from the same cloth, which was, again, it was sort of this scrappiness. And we kind of applied that, that sort of scrappiness to, it's sort of this non-dogmatic approach just to figuring out what works and just willingness to try anything and that seems like a good idea. That worked pretty well.
But just, I guess, as a quick follow-up, did you notice that there was like anything particularly at the tactical level that people knew about or had backgrounds in that made them like particularly good at growth?
So back then, I would say no, because none of us had a background in anything. I mean, none of us had done payments before.
Yeah.
No one had really done a startup before. In fact, it was probably helpful we didn't know anything about payments because all the payments experts said that what we did couldn't be done, that Visa, MasterCard laws or rules would prohibit it, and so on. So sometimes it's good to be kind of ignorant of, conventional wisdom, or because it imposes constraints on what you think you can do. But today, what I would say is, all this thinking has become much more institutionalized somehow. Now we have these like growth hacker roles and so on. I think those types of people can be a useful tool or sort of weapon in your arsenal. So it's very helpful to be able to, like, again, do these A/B tests where you can launch a feature and see if it affects one-day retention or virality or something like that. But I feel like, and I think most people realize that, but I think it's almost gotten to the point now where people are using this like math as a substitute for really creative thinking about this stuff. And it's almost become like this religion of testing that I'm very much against. I like the use of testing to sanity check what the product founders believe. So you're not just running off in some direction that is wrong and you never correct. But I think that you can't just leave it to the math people or the analytics people to tell you what to do, because all they are doing really is validating or refuting hypotheses. They typically don't, they're not the ones typically that generate the hypotheses. Sometimes you'll get like a rare one who is like both art and science. But I think we've gotten to the point now where we're like, we somehow think that this growth hacking stuff is all about science, and I think it's much more about art. It's much more about creatively generating a technique that no one's thought of before.
Thank you.
Hi, I have two questions from the online students. The first one is, first student wants to know whether or not you have any plans to make any future films, produce any feature films. And then the second wants to know what were the benefits and downfalls of being a consultant in your early years versus joining a startup.
Right. Okay, so on the movies, no plans right now, but I'll keep you posted if I change my mind. On the consulting thing, so basically, you guys are living at a great time in history, because I graduated from college in 1994. It was the year before the Netscape IPO, which kind of launched the whole internet as a commercial force. And by that point, I was in law school. I graduated in '98. I kind of thought I had missed the whole web thing, and then I joined a consulting firm because I kind of had this vague intuition that I wanted to do business, not law, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And like the whole path to being an entrepreneur back then was so much harder. I mean, they didn't have programs like this. They didn't have all the resources that are online to kind of like the whole lean startup movement, all that like didn't exist. Blogging didn't even exist, really. I mean, that didn't start until like the mid-2000s. So all the knowledge sharing that's available now to help you on your path to being an entrepreneur wasn't there, and I really had no clue how to get into it. And being a consultant wasn't like bad or anything, but then Peter Thiel called me up and convinced me to join him at PayPal, and so I quit my job after about 10 months and went to go. I never kind of looked back from there.
So I've been working really hard, really long on a bunch of great ideas. I'm really excited about them, but now I'm looking at Mark Andreessen in the New York Times and everything that's been happening the last year or so. Should I throw out everything and just work on a Bitcoin startup? How important is Bitcoin?
So yeah, I mean, Bitcoin's pretty interesting. I think the technology is pretty amazing, meaning there's a real breakthrough around it that I'm not sure like the people who criticize it understand. And the innovation is that Bitcoin is able to create centralized authority without there being a central authority in this completely bottom-up sort of crowdsourced way. It's through the blockchain, the open ledger of transactions. That is new. So there have been movements to create cryptocurrency before. You know, PayPal is kind of, it's certainly a way to instantaneously transfer money online, but you have to rely on PayPal. And in all previous attempts, there was some central authority that you had to trust. Bitcoin is completely decentralized, and it's been around long enough now that we can say with pretty high confidence that that the Bitcoin protocol itself can't be hacked. So the wallets, you know, wallets can be hacked. Coins have been stolen out of wallets, but no one's been able to create a fake Bitcoin. So Bitcoin's the first way to, I would say, transfer a digital asset as opposed to merely copying it. And that's fundamentally new. Now, should you create a Bitcoin startup? I mean, I think a couple issues there. The first one is, I actually bought Bitcoin last year because I thought the potential was great. That doesn't mean it's likely, but if it does work, I think it's going to be really transformative. So you should just understand that if you start a Bitcoin startup, you not only have the risk of your own startup, whether that works, but obviously you're dependent on Bitcoin itself working. And it's hard to assess the probabilities. The second thing is, and this is probably the bigger issue, is that by the time a space is hot, it's frequently too late. Like you really want to get into a space before everyone thinks it's like cool and sexy. So when Yammer got into enterprise software in 2008, like nobody was doing it. I mean, one of the main reasons why we got it, why Yammer pursued enterprise social networking is because nobody was doing enterprise startups anymore, and certainly, and because of that, we thought applying consumer DNA and viral techniques and so on to the enterprise could be really interesting. So I think you can't just say, I'm going to do a Bitcoin startup. You've got to figure out an idea that nobody else is doing that you can really execute better. And that might be hard now because, frankly, there's people who got into it last year. So I wouldn't want to discourage you from doing a Bitcoin startup. I would just be aware that it's a hot space, so you better have some really, really interesting take.
If you had to start a startup today, what would it be?
If I was going to do a startup today, what would it be?
Well, because you mentioned already that we have to look in like pretty much into the future. So think of something that it's going to happen in the next like few years.
Right. It's really hard for me to say. I guess I would choose a space that I feel has been overlooked in some way. I would choose a space that is, again, is kind of unsexy. No one's really talking about it. And yet it's kind of mystifying why not, given how big it is. And it could be a thing in a few years. I try and be like 2 or 3 years ahead of the curve. I think it's too hard to see beyond that. And in any event, you probably, you don't want to be too early. So, I don't know, that's not like a great answer. But, one thing you might want to consider is, I think this is the extent you're doing business software is I think a lot of the big horizontal plays have kind of been done already. So meaning Salesforce created a CRM layer for all types of businesses. Yammer is sort of social for all business types. There's marketing and so on. I think those tools might be tapped out. What's not tapped out are vertical plays, sort of industry-specific software. So, you know, for instance, there's this company, Viva, that IPO'd in the last year. One of the Yammer investors was their first investor. And they do CRM just for health sciences companies. And it's got like a multi-billion-dollar valuation. So I think it's still possible to do industry-specific things that are interesting. But I wouldn't even necessarily consider that idea terribly original. Like Emergence, which is the investor I'm talking about, they've had that thesis now for a few years. But I think it's probably better than doing something purely horizontal. Just, you know, so that might help winnow down the ideas.
I was just curious, what kind of industries get you really excited?
You know, I don't have sort of rules about this necessarily. Like, so for instance, I would not have thought the yellow cab industry would be exciting. You know, but Uber gets me excited. I use it like every day, you know, and, you know, so I think really any industry can be exciting if you've got the right innovation to disrupt it. I don't think it's helpful for entrepreneurs to have too many rules about what industries they're willing to do, because I think that just closes off your mind to possibilities. And like I said, I think given a choice between doing something that nobody else is thinking about and something that's like the latest trend, I would always rather do the thing that no one's really thinking about, because you're just going to have less competition and it's less kind of picked over. I mean, there's the hot spaces are going to already have lots of ideas being funded. So I try not to apply rules like that. One thing I will say is that I do get especially excited about products I actually use. So one of the things I try to do is any product that I actually use and love, I will try to invest in. That's probably like my main criteria for investing, is if I myself am a user. And if somehow it can get on page one of my like iPhone apps, then it's like, you know, back up the truck, you know, can I put all my money in this company? Because, you know, I'm willing to believe that if I love the product, that other people will too, and that's probably like the main thing I look at these days. All right, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Alrighty, guys, let's take a 3-minute break. Stand up, stretch. If you need to use the bathroom, use the bathroom. We're going to be back here at 11:05, okay, for our next presentation. Yes. The bathroom is right through that back door over there. The women's is on the left, and then the men's is walk 2 clicks, and it's on your left as well.